Patterson Mural dedication. If you could all take your seats, we're going to go ahead and get started with the dedication ceremony. Thank you.
Good morning. I want to thank everybody for coming and welcome you all to the Patterson Mural dedication. Seems very fitting to have this dedication today on Patterson Day in Greenfield, Ohio. Like many people here today, I've shared this story many times. And at the end of the story, I usually get, nah, that didn't all happen to one family. So I'd like to thank the people that have backed me up with Tom Smith. Of course, I always use my mother. Go ask my mom. She'll tell you it's true. So I need to do a little housekeeping before we get started. I need to thank several people. I want to thank the Antique Car Club of Greenfield for relocating the car show up to Jefferson Street to make this even more special today. I want to thank the committee that put this together, Allie Davis Vesey, Heidi Arrington, Jeremy Lovely, Jessica Leverton, Nancy Crawford, Tom Smith, and April Malloy, who played a big part in getting this all together. I want to thank people for donating to the mural. G3 put this together, Grow Greater Greenfield, and I want to thank a lot of people that made this a reality. Hannah Blevins, Blevins Law, Harriet Fout, South Central Power, the Village of Greenfield, Greenfield Eagles, Greenfield Foundation, the Greenfield Rotary Club, Tom Smith, Jack Marksbank, the Shorter Chapel AME Church, Brent McMurray, William Mowry, Deborah Stewart, Shannon Slayton, Tracy Sutherland, Kimberly Dennis, George Ford, and we got a lot of research and support from the Greenfield Historical Society, John King, Harold Schmidt, and Chris Nelson. So before we get started with our first speaker, I would like to introduce Reverend Ruth Ames for probably the most important thing we're going to do here today, give us a prayer.
Let us bow our heads. As I was thinking about this prayer, I was reminded of 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 18. In everything, give thanks. This is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. And I would say when he says for you, it means for all of us. And I say, Heavenly Father, I come at this hour to give you thanks for what I believe you put in the minds and in the heart of someone or others to put the mural of the Pattersons and what they had done many years ago on the wall. Some of us assembled here this day may not have been done near what had been done many years ago in this town. You are now being enlightened. There have been many other people that lifted up progress in this town, but we aren't here, praise the Lord. We aren't here today to talk about them, and I'm not going to mention them for fear that I would leave out someone. Father, I know all about each of us. I know that you know all about each of us, and you know that I had heard about the Pattersons, but I didn't think too much about it when I'd heard it. I only think of how this town seems to be in a regressing state. Maybe, just maybe, this might cause some of us to think and might try to us to put it on the mind and heart of those in charge to really try to help us in this town to come out of the regressing state and progress and come to life because of our thanks to God who sent his son, Jesus, to die to save our souls. Maybe you and I will grow in love and progress in this town instead of regressing. Again, I say thanks to God in this and to his son Jesus for allowing this mural to be put on the wall this day. God is so good to us, and I thank him how good he was to the Patterson family. I ask, Father God, that you continue to be with us, to lead and guide us in all that we do here, to lift up this town and to do your will, O Lord God, that we come together in love. Help us, Lord God, and we thank you this day again for the mural that was put on the wall. We thank you, Lord, for all that you do for each of us here in this town, and we give you all praise and all glory in Jesus' name, and for his sake I pray. Amen.
Our first speaker today is a 1962 graduate of McLean High School, where he played football, basketball, and ran track. He spent over 20 years in the education and 10 years in the juvenile court system in Montgomery County. Our first speaker today and his wife have 3 lovely children. I would like to introduce you to George Ford.
I thank you. I'd like to make one correction, though. My wife, Linda, and I have a combined family, and we have several other kids. So I want to let you know that, Linda, ahead of time. Okay, what a beautiful day to be here, okay? And I guess let me first say thanks to G3, Nancy Crawford, the artist, and others who have contributed to this dedication of the Patterson family mural. And a special recognition of our special guest, Richard Patterson, and his family. Although I was born in Greenfield and was a 1962 graduate of Edward Lee McLean High School, I had no knowledge of one of the most prominent families that ever lived in my hometown. After leaving Greenfield, I attended Wilmington College and subsequently spent a career in public education in Dayton, and still was not aware of the Patterson family and its contribution to this city and to Ohio and American history. In the year 2007, I was visiting Greenfield McLean High School and ran into Bob Watts, who had been a former teacher and coach of mine. In that chance meeting with Bob, he informed me of the work that the Greenfield Historical Society was doing about this family, which had produced the only known manufactured by an African American owned company. That was my first awareness of the Patterson family. From that encounter, I began to do some research and gained a cursory knowledge of the Patterson family. In 2003, the Hillsborough African American Awareness Research Council asked me to be a speaker during their Black History Month. I chose to give my talk on the Patterson family. Early on in my research, I learned that in Greenfield, the contributions and legacy of the Patterson family had been kept alive. This is primarily due to the work of Tom Smith, who has the most extensive collection of Patterson-produced carriages, buggies, and artifacts, as well as the brothers Dave and John King, who also have one of the buggies, and the work of the Historical Society. I also learned that in recent years there were celebrations in the city of Greenfield which recognized the accomplishments of the Patterson family. Although I was away and not aware of those celebrations at the time, it was so gratifying to know that the city had not forgotten the outstanding family and their unique contribution. In my research, I also learned that at Carillon Park in Dayton, there is a restored Patterson wagon and history board prominently displayed, that the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. used the Patterson Company in one of its brochures for the new African American Museum. Now I will share a few facts from my research. The Charles Richard Patterson family was very instrumental in the early growth and development of Greenfield, Ohio. C.R., as he is known, C.R. Patterson and Sons family business flourished in Greenfield for over 70 years. In recent months, I have shared with my friends and associates with much pride the contribution the Patterson family made in the business of making buggies, carriages, cars, buses in the late 1800s and early 1900s in Greenfield, Ohio. I now realize that in growing up in Greenfield, I had known some Patterson employees. Walter Bird, who was a good friend of my father, worked for a Patterson company and even went to Gallipolis with the company when it left Greenfield. Others who worked for the Patterson company were Harford Jennings and his wife Elizabeth, who were parents of my classmates Terry, who also Horace Bailey, who sponsored fish fries in his side yard on Evans Street, and Harry McCarter, ignition expert and mechanic, who had a shop near 2nd and North Street. He had a shop there located near the church, but not at the church, of course. Charles Richard Patterson, better known as C.R. Patterson, was born a free person of color in April 1833. Earlier sources have stated he was born enslaved on a plantation in Virginia. However, recent research reveals that he came to Ohio with his parents, Charles and Nancy Patterson, who were also free people for generations. At an early age, C.R. found gainful employment as a blacksmith and a local carriage maker. This employment gave him knowledge and practical experience that would eventually offer him an opportunity to develop skills leading to his future ownership of a company making transportation vehicles. In 1883, C.R. Patterson entered a partnership with J.P. Lowe that would last for 20 years, during which time the company would build a variety of buggies and carriages. Eventually, J.P. Lowe's share of the business was purchased by C.R., who went on to establish the C.R. Patterson Company. This company would make vehicles known for their quality and durability. The Patterson Company took much pride in the workmanship of the product they produced. Materials that were used were carefully selected. The company provided employment for a diverse workforce. The workforce consisted of both black and white employees who were reported to have been well paid for that time. The company used skilled employees. In 1865, C.R. married Josephine Oates. They had 4 children, 2 boys, Frederick Douglass Patterson, who was born in 1871 and died in 1932, Samuel Patterson, who was born in 1875 and died in 1899. Both would eventually join their fathers to form the C.R. Patterson and Sons Company. C.R. Patterson very much valued education. His son Frederick, having graduated from the Greenfield 8th grade by all rights, should have been enrolled in Greenfield High School in the fall of 1886. Frederick was denied the opportunity because the superintendent and Greenfield Board of Education claimed that he looked colored but was treated as such in the community. A case was filed with the court to admit Frederick to the all-white high school. After much wrangling back and forth with the courts, the Board of Education was ordered to admit Frederick to high school in the spring of 1887 of that year. Upon graduation from high school, Frederick enrolled at Ohio State University. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Stuart.
Thank you much, George. Our next speaker today is a 1975 graduate of McLean High School. He spent over 17 years working at computer stock forums. On his father's passing, he took over the family car business. He is the past president of Ohio Independent Automobile Dealers Association and a 25-year member. I have known him my entire life. He's been a historian and a collector of Patterson memorabilia. Please help me welcome Tom Smith.
Thanks, Stuart, and thanks, George. When I first met George and his wife, they came to the lot, and he said, "I'm George Ford and Linda Ford," and I said, "I got a brother named George and a sister named Linda," so I can remember that. So anyway, welcome to Almost a City, Greenfield, Ohio, population almost 5,000 people. I had a friend that worked for the city council years ago, and he said back in the 70s, we had a recount of the census, and they were short probably 10 or 15 people. So I said, anyway, they recounted, and they came back and said, well, we're past 5,000. I said, what'd you do? Count all the dogs at my neighbor's house and all the cats at my father and mother's house. And anyway, that put us way past that 5,000 mark. Another funny thing was my granddaughter, every time she comes down here, 6-year-old girl, she always says, "Papa, you live in the middle of nowhere." And I said, well, we aren't really nowhere. We're in between Fayette, Highland, and Ross counties. We're in the middle. But anyway, this is home of the first and only black-owned car manufacturer in North America. And I'm going to go back a little bit before George, when Greenfield first started. Duncan MacArthur, 1799. But the early settlers, they moved here with one reason to do was to work on anti-slavery. In April of 1833, the abolition of Paint Valley was founded. Now, 1833 was the year C.R. Patterson was born in Virginia before he came to Greenfield, and probably around 1842. Its main effort was to educate and to do missionary work in the stance of ending slavery. They disbanded, but they quickly reorganized as the Greenfield Anti-Slavery Society. Now, very few records were ever kept of this because the large number of citizens in this area helped the African Americans to gain freedom, and Greenfield played a major part in ending slavery. Last Sunday, Reverend Mike Anderson had a great story on the Underground Railroad that came through Greenfield, and it's on YouTube. If you look up First Presbyterian Church, it's very good. He talked about Samuel Crothers and Beatties and the ones that played a vital part in that. CR learned blacksmithing in a very young age, and I'm sure his whole family was in the blacksmithing learning part. And it's a very hard job, very dirty job. If you looked up anything on it, it's very, very hard job. Them guys had some muscles and arms. But it was in high demand during the Civil War, and you could earn up to $3 a day, which is big money in the 1860s. CR had 2 brothers lost in the Civil War. Chris would back me on that. Chris is a great historian. And anyway, during that time in Ohio, it played a very, very big role. We lost over 10% of all the men in Ohio lost their lives. And they said at one time everybody living now that's in Ohio had lost somebody to that war in some relation, somewhat. There was over 620,000 deaths. The black community, which helped a tremendous amount, was 180,000 blacks were enlisted into the service. 40,000 died, 10 of them in battle, and 30,000 died in just because wounds and illness. You know, they had no penicillin, no antibiotics, anything like that. But anyway, I'm going to jump back to where George left off because I kind of jumped before. After he graduated high school, and by the way, CR sued the Greenfield City Schools and Superintendent Mueller, and they won, and they had to pay court costs because I wanted to say that. So anyway, had a little money come out of their pocket. Fred enrolled at the Ohio State University. He found the atmosphere much more welcoming. OSU yielded its first football team in 1890. They were just a ragtag team of group of students. And it was their first game on record. They played Ohio Wesleyan, and the Buckeyes win 20-14. That stands as their first official game win in program history, and that was in May of 1890. That November, I don't know how they split these up, but they played the other 3 games in November of 1890. Different batch of players. The next 3 games, 3 losses. Anyway, one of those games against the Lords or Kenyon, Fred Patterson scooped up a fumble late in the game and ran it into the end zone to be the first African American to score a touchdown for the Buckeyes. So he's on record for that. The next season, 1891, Patterson was asked to be a full-fledged member of the varsity team. The first African American football player to earn a letterman's jacket played 4 games that year. Played 4 games the year before and 4 games, so that must have been a big stance for him. Anyway, this is a big blow. The first game to Western Reserve, loss at home, 56-0. The next game, 26-0, not as bad, defeat at Kenyon. So that was an away game. Okay, now here's what the team said. The team said, the playing field was in poor condition and officials were clearly favored their home team. I said, that sounds like Greenfield McLean. Their football and basketball. Anyway, they practiced for 2 weeks, and they resumed again at Denison, and they had a win, 8-4 win. And the last game of the season, Akron, 6-0, a shutout. So they ended that year 50-50, not bad. Now, I'm going to look at some accomplishments that he did do there, and I can't list all of them. It's like I told Chris, we could talk all day about Patterson's, but he accomplished quite a bit. Fred was in many activities, an active member of the Horton Literary Society, as corresponding secretary and vice president in 1892. Also that year, he served as assistant business manager of the Lantern, and that's the student newspaper, and it's still made today. They still make that paper today. Let me get a drink. And he was editor of that newspaper also. But the biggest position that he held at Ohio State that year, he was class president, class of 1893. Now that shows what a pillar student he was to his classmates and peers. He was also involved in other sports. He dabbled a little bit in baseball, and he was in the military drill team. Now, after his junior year ended in high state, he took a teaching job in Kentucky and not to return to OSU. Now, Fred wrote to the editor, Walter J. Sears, and these are Fred's words, these are Fred's quote. I am down here in the land of good whiskey, fast horses, and fair women. And to tell you honestly, William J., I am making hay in a way that is pleasure to me. My eyes are being opened, and I am getting a glimpse of the field which I will have to tread in a year or two, and when I return to OSU, I think it will be a matter of ease to direct my effort in a line that will most benefit me hereafter. I would have liked to have returned, Walt. I finished with my class, but you can appreciate the fact that the OSU is not the world and that my battles must be fought upon ground different from that occupied by your fellows. For that reason, I am trying my hand at experience. And let me tell you, it is the best of teachers. Okay, now when I read that, I thought, sounds like he's making hay with his girlfriend and good whiskey. Well, it doesn't get much better than that. Trying to find his place in life, and he liked teaching. I think he really liked teaching. But he had to relinquish his position as class president. He wanted to return to OSU, but he had to relinquish that. And teachers were in high demand, especially in the black community. And Fred, or Chris even put it in his book, and I knew that too, but it just, I think he liked it and stayed. But anyway, Fred stayed in Kentucky as a professor of history at Louisville Center High School. He stayed 4 years or over, and he met Betty Esteline Postel of Hopkinsville, Kentucky. She was a teacher, and she was actually a daughter of one of the wealthiest black businessmen in Kentucky. And I think his name was Pete. Man, he's got a story, very big story too, because he was like worth $500,000 in way back. So he was worth a lot of moolah. But anyway, Frederick Postel, wait a minute. They got married on September 11th, 1901. They had two sons. I always got a kick out of this: Frederick Postel Patterson and Postel Patterson. So I could hear Esteline say, "F Postel and Postel, get over here." You know, I don't know how they would say that, but anyway, Fred's younger brother Samuel, this is in 1899, a couple years before he got married, and Chris and we talk about it often. And we don't know really what happened, but he was found in Paint Creek floating with a noose around his neck. They didn't say one thing in the Greenfield paper about it, nothing, but in the Hillsborough paper, it said that he committed suicide. I don't know how you do that, but that was in 1899. But you never heard anything from Fred or CR, so we really don't know. Anyway, Fred came back after that to help his ailing father in the family business, which is where Southern Community Savings Bank is. And 9 years later, after he was married, his dad, CR, passes away in 1910, leaving Fred with the reins to convert buggies into the next generation of autos and buses. And he foreseen that the horseless carriages and buggies and cars were going to be the future. So I think he was a great mechanic. On September 23rd, 1915, his first Greenfield Patterson automobile rolled out into the streets of Washington Street. That was his first car, but you have to remember Henry Ford had already made 1 million cars by 1915. And in 1908, I think Fred was working on a lot of cars, because in 1908, Greenfield had a big 30 cars in town. And that's from David and John King. He printed me up the types of cars and stuff. So, but C.R. Patterson and Fred were inducted into the Automotive Hall of Fame. This was in July 22, 2 of 2021, along with Jay Leno and other guests, but in the podium it was Jay Leno and C.R. Patterson and Frederick Patterson, which was pretty cool. Chris was there, Richard was there, and I was there, and I took my small doctor's buggy, which is that, and that was on display twice up there. But I wanted to say that this has been a long past due award for this family to get the recognition of their accomplishments, credits due for their hardships, hard work, and adversity in the transportation business. And there's other special people that really helped me along the way that I really liked and thought a lot of. It was, I just want to mention them, George Foltz, Paul Orr, Bob Watts, which was mentioned earlier, and Ed King, who just recently passed away a couple months ago. Those guys were really great guys, and thank G3 and the Historical Society. The mural's paid for. If you want to donate anything to the Historical Society or G3, they'll take $1 or more. And basically that's it. I have a display on there, over there. I have a couple other items that I couldn't bring because they needed too much work. But I'll let Chris talk. If he can fill in the spots that I missed, and then we'll let Richard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. Our next speaker has written a couple books. He's been the associate producer on several movies, the executive producer of several movies. He is in Cobra Kai, Season 5, Episode 6. I mean, this guy's got his own IMDb page. But when I first met Christopher, he was my son's cross-country coach. And he showed a patience and kindness to young men that you don't see from other young men. I would please help me welcome Christopher Nelson.
All right. Good morning, everyone. So I'm usually talking more about the history of the Patterson Company, but they told me to talk more about myself today and my research into the books and now the movie and documentary and all of that. But since Mr. Ford and Mr. Smith both talked about the school, CR suing and everything, there's one really, really important fact about that neither one of them mentioned, but I'm going to mention because it was a real game changer and it kind of sets the tone for this story. Ohio became a state in 1803. The Constitution of Ohio in 1803 had black codes or black laws in it. At that time, a black man did not have the right to sue. So you have to take your hat off and tip it to that white judge who actually said, yes, I'll hear this case. And this case went on for like 8-9 months, back and forth. I mean, the school board, they would make an argument and then CR would make a counter argument, and this judge could have cut it off at any moment. So the fact that that judge ruled in their favor and said, no, you have to admit him with all the same rights as the white students, that said something right there. And here's the big thing. Fred Patterson said, I'm not just going to get in here and get my education. He graduated as valedictorian. So that was one of those, that set the tone for this story. Yeah, so in my mind, that really set the tone of that was one of those early obstacles that they faced and they overcame. And it goes on for their whole 74 years in business through 3 generations of this family. And, it just one thing after another. So I grew up in neighboring Sabina. So it's 15, 16 miles up the road here. And I've been hearing the Patterson story, little tidbits about it for 50 plus years now. But as a little child, I didn't think much about black or white. I was always into cars, even when I was really, really young. So I thought it was cool. Wow, there was a car manufacturer right down the road in Greenfield. Because I came here with my mom about every 2 weeks and went to Gossett's when it was open to get church supplies for the office and all of that. So Greenfield was almost like a second home to me even then. And so I was like, wow, there was a car manufacturer in this little tiny town that's almost, Sabina was a little smaller, but still, it was a really small town, and I was just really impressed with that. But then as I got a little bit older, and I'd come to the Green Country Town Festival and Wheels of Progress Festival and all of that, and people would talk about the Pattersons and everything, then the whole black-white thing it became more real to me, because, I started realizing there was a bias there and all of that. So this was really a special story. So it was just something that was always with me. I had some interest in it, no research or anything. It was a really cool story. So I lived here in Greenfield for about 4 years in the early 2000s, so like 2000, 2004. And that was during the time that the Patterson shop was torn down. And the story kind of really resurfaced in the newspapers, and, Historical Society had big things about it and everything. And I became even more interested. And of course, I was much older at that point. And so a few years later, I went to graduate school for industrial archaeology and history. So anything to do with the Industrial Revolution, factories, any kind of manufacturing, all of that. And, I'd already done one thesis in archaeology, and they're like, well, we don't have, money for excavations and all of that. They're like, you're going to have to come up with your own money. I was like, well, hey, industrial archaeology is a combination of archaeology and history. I'm like, I've already done archaeology. What if I do a history? And so my advisor was like, what do you have in mind? And I'm like, I'll tell you what. And I told them a little bit about the story of the Pattersons. And my advisor was like, I write books about vintage cars, and I've never heard of this. And he's like, go for it. So what I did, since it was, I thought I already knew, the basic story and everything, the history, but nobody really talked about the technical details of all the different types of vehicles they made and their factory and all of that. So that was my research focus. And so I started getting into all of that, but then in that research, I kept discovering these other little tidbits of history, and I'm like, wow, that's pretty cool. I've never heard that before. Nobody's really talked about that openly. It's not in the papers and all of that. And so I started adding a little bit more tidbits of the history in there. But again, my focus for my master's thesis was mainly on the technical stuff. And so by the time I got done, my advisor pointed his finger at me. He was like, you'd be an idiot not to put this out to the public. So basically, my master's thesis became the first edition of the book. But I'm going to step back a little bit and tell about some of the research and a real eye-opening moment for me, which Tom's already talked about, Ohio State a bit, but I only had a team photo from 1890 or 1891 that had Fred on it. And it was like a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy of a newspaper that had been photocopied. So it was really grainy. And I'm like, Ohio State Archives, they have to have a good, clean copy of this photo. So I went up and I asked for it. So I'm sitting in there, and they're like, it's going to take us a little while to find it, but here's some other materials from that period. And they slid a bunch of stuff across the table to me. So I'm sitting there flipping through, and I pick up an 1891 yearbook. And I'm flipping through it, and all of a sudden I see my guy's name, Frederick D. Patterson. And Tom's already mentioned this, but it said president of the class of 1893. And it's like my mind almost exploded. I was like, wait a minute. I mean, I get chills every time I tell somebody that portion of this story. It's like, there was something really special about this guy. I mean, what was so different? So then my research went even deeper and deeper, and I started really looking at it, and I found all these other things, like how they didn't just break color barriers in business when they became the first black auto manufacturer. I mean, he was the first black football player at Ohio State. I mean, they broke color barriers in politics. I mean, Frederick Patterson was the first black delegate to the Republican National Convention for the state of Ohio. I mean, that was just amazing. I mean, just all these different things. He was such a good businessman that Booker T. Washington recruited him to help him found the Negro Business League at Tuskegee in 1900. Now, one thing about Booker T. Washington and the Negro Business League, he did not really like northern businessmen, black or white. And the reason is the North was more industrial. The South was more agricultural. So they were all about helping the black farmers and, the Southern businesses. But he had so much respect for Fred Patterson that he brought this northern businessman down here, down to Tuskegee. Sorry, I live in the South now. So and to help him found the Negro Business League, which Frederick Patterson served as a vice president for like the first decade of the league. So I mean, lots of interactions. I have letters between the two, and Emmett Scott, who was the secretary of the Negro Business League and all of that. I mean, Fred was traveling down there all the time and making sales in the South. You know, a lot of the doctor's buggies and later cars and all of that, they're all through the South. So they're not just up here in this area. I mean, it became kind of a really almost nationwide thing for the Pattersons. But yeah, I mean, it's just one thing after another I found during this research, and the story became more and more amazing. And like obstacle after obstacle, like obviously buggies and carriages, they built them for 50 years. That's what they did. But then, you know, like Tom said, 1908, there were what, 30 cars here in Greenfield. But by like 1912, 13, 14, I mean, it was growing and growing and growing very rapidly. Less people were buying, horse-drawn vehicles. So Fred decided to get into auto repair. Don't know exactly when they really started doing it, because it was very common for blacksmiths to repair early vehicles, because early vehicles looked a lot like buggies and carriages. That way your local blacksmith could repair them and all of that. They didn't know much about motors and all of that, but that's something that Fred learned about. They ran their first official advertisement in 1913 for auto repair. So they became a full service shop, and then in 1915, they introduced their first car. Problem is, as Tom said, 1 month after they sold or put out their first car, Henry Ford sold his 1 millionth Model T. They just came onto the scene too late. And it was not, a lot of people compare the Model T and the Patterson Greenfield car. It's really not a comparison. The Patterson Greenfield was a higher level car. The Model T was made for every man. It was really cheap. It was something that everybody could buy, which is why they dominated the streets. They were everywhere. But the Patterson Greenfield was more of a higher mid-level car. I mean, it would have been about $22,000 in today's money. So, I mean, that was a lot of money for back then. So, I mean, they just didn't really sell very well. But one saving grace for them was that was like 1915, 1918 era. World War I is going on. So people didn't really use trucks and stuff here. They were pretty unreliable prior to the war. But then before the war, trucks had to become more reliable. You could not strand your soldiers and equipment out there on the battlefield. So Dodge and Ford and all of those, they had to build trucks for the war effort. They were not allowed to sell to private citizens. So Frederick Patterson's like, this car thing's not working out so well. We're going to make a shift to trucks and buses. Well, it so happened about that time, just a couple years after that, there was another school consolidation effort across the state, and then you needed more school transportation. So motorized transportation became really big, so they really started focusing on the school buses. Little shop that sat right up here on the corner was making 500 buses a year. In 1929, there was a census of school buses across all of Ohio. I can't speak for the rest of the states, but for Ohio, I found the numbers. And 36.8% of all school buses in Ohio were built right here in Greenfield by the Patterson Company. That's a huge, huge amount. Here's the kicker. 50% were homemade, where there were no bus standards yet. So it's like the school board said, hey, janitor, go out there and take this empty Model T chassis and build a box and put it on it, because we have to transport these students. So you take away that 50%, only 14% of all buses in Ohio came from the Patterson's competitors. I mean, that's pretty impressive. They were known as pioneers in that effort. And even earlier than that, when the first school consolidation happened, they made horse-drawn school transportation. And the Ohio Board of Education, the superintendent of that, even recognized them as being pioneers in that, and it became the model for all school wagons across the state. I really wish I could find one of those. I know Tom would probably buy that in a second if we could find one of those, but I mean, they sold lots of those. So when they shifted to school buses, guess what? They already had a clientele built up. They already knew these guys from the earlier efforts, and these school boards were just buying these things up. Transportation buses for regular city transit. The first buses on the streets of Cincinnati, built right here in Greenfield. And the sad thing is they delivered them to Cincinnati, and then they had to ride in the back of the bus after they got there. I mean, if that doesn't say something, I mean, it's like, so this story has success, it has conflict. I mean, everything wasn't great. Yeah, I sound like a cheerleader for them, but I point out there were those obstacles they had to deal with, you know. So, you know, after I first put out the book, the first edition, I got a call about 3-4 months later from Washington, D.C., and it was from the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. So they're the founders of Black History Month. I mean, Carter G. Woodson, the father of Black history, he founded this organization. So it's been around for decades. And they're like, hey, you know, like, we want you to come and be a featured author at the Black History Month luncheon. So this is like 2-3 blocks from the White House. So President Obama was president at that time, and he was supposed to come and speak to us, and then something happened in Libya or something. He wasn't able to make it, but, you know, it was pretty cool. I was invited. There's 1,200 people there, and they're most all like professors and like Black history studies and all of that. So my book was used in classrooms at universities all across the nation because they thought this was so cool, because there's not a lot of Black success stories from that period when it comes to manufacturing. Carter G. Woodson, I just mentioned him. He did a census in 1900. 0.02%, 0.02% of the Black population at that time were actively engaged in manufacturing. There was a 5 million Black population in the United States at that time. That means about 1,100 people, and most of them were like cigars and cosmetics. The Pattersons stood almost nearly alone in manufacturing stuff like vehicles and larger products, because at the time they were afraid to compete with the white businessmen, because what if the white folks would not buy from them? That was a lot of money to invest in everything. C.R. Patterson said, I don't care. If you make a product that is as good as anybody else's, they won't care what color you are. They're going to buy it. You know what? He proved it. He did it. These guys, they advertised like crazy. I mean, I have over 1,200 advertisements that I collected from them. Every single week in the newspaper, they would have a different advertisement. And they're not like advertisements today where it was short little snippets like, buy this, you know, it's the best, or whatever. I mean, they put like entire paragraphs in there describing things, and they'd be like, hey, we just added this new equipment, these 2 new electric generators in the factory, come by and see it. And this and that, that helped me piece the factory back together, like what they had and how it was set up and all of that at that time. So, you know, it was an amazing journey doing all of this research. And as Tom was mentioning, in 2021, they got inducted into the Automotive Hall of Fame. So, you know, we were all up there, and I ended up meeting a film production company. And, you know, they started talking to me, and, you know, they're hearing snippets about this story, like, this is amazing. They're like, you know, would you like to make a movie about this? You know, it's like, twist my arm, you know, please don't make me do this, you know. So we started conversations, and the screenwriter asked me, well, we're going to need these personal traits and characteristics of the Patterson family. And I'm like, huh. I'm like, that wasn't part of my research. It was more about technical details and all of that. So I had the fun of going back through like my 2,000 hours of master's research again and looking at it with new eyes. And, you know, it was like, you know, all right, so all that stuff I skipped over because it wasn't important to my technical details at that time, I'm now picking up on, you know, and like meeting people like Richard Patterson over here and several other Patterson family members. They started handing out stuff. Hey, here's this information, personal details you're not going to find in a newspaper or a book or anything like that. And like, they gave me so much that helped me piece this story together. And it ended up being a second edition of the book, which is double what the first one was. So now we do have more of those details in there. It's more of a complete story at this point. We'll never know everything, but it's a story of that transition and obstacle and success and failure, and then next obstacle and success. It just keeps going and going and going for those 74 years in business. And it's just been such an honor to be able to tell this story. And I mean, it's an honor, you know, the Pattersons have let me be their family historian and tell their story. And, you know, I worked with that Hollywood film studio for, you know, 2 years or so. You know, and they started helping me get things developed, kind of got me into the film business a bit and everything, because I'm an archaeologist. We don't do that kind of stuff. This is not my world. But then more recently, I got contacted back in February by my new colleagues at Bright Morning Star Films in Nashville. I live just outside of Nashville now. And I was like, wow, that'd be really nice to be able to film locally. That way I can be more involved in everything. And you know what? They've been so supportive. They have picked this movie up. We're making a movie. and a documentary about the Patterson story, and we're going to get Greenfield and the Patterson story, that recognition they deserve. There's so much history in this town. I mean, the crazy thing is the Pattersons were only the third largest employers in this town. I mean, with their 70 employees, and that's something nobody's mentioned yet. I mean, black and white workers working side by side, an integrated workforce, and that was so uncommon at the time. I mean, we're talking 1870s, 1880s, and guess what? The boss was black. That's even more rare. And I mean, there's interviews from people from, decades later that worked for them. And these white guys would be like, these are the best people I have ever worked for. So, I mean, the story is just amazing. But yeah, this research has taken me all across the United States. I now have right at 1,700 documents from the Patterson Company or from their time. I restricted my sources to 1939 and before, because there's a lot of things that circulated around, like the whole escaped slave story and all of that. That's a myth, and so I kind of restricted my research to 1939 and before, and I was able to get 1,700 or so documents, most of them written in either CR or Frederick's own words, and that's how I was able to piece this story together. So again, it's been an honor to tell this story, and there's a lot more to come, and I hope you guys enjoy yourself today. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris. You just got to experience what every time I've been around Christopher, I've enjoyed every minute of it. Our next speaker has a few relatives that he might have heard about today. His father and uncle ran the Patterson Company for the last 7 years. He and his lovely wife, Carolyn, of 58 years, have traveled all the way from Phoenix, Arizona to be with us today. You are going to love this. Please help me welcome Richard Patterson.
A little correction, not Phoenix, Tucson, a real city. Good morning, everyone. I'm sitting here listening to my history. Our family's done a lot, but one of the things I wanted to, when we talked about me coming here and doing this, they said, I want you to talk about your dad and your uncle. And so I said I was going to do that. But one thing, we were talking about Frederick Douglass and what he did at Ohio State. And my brother, Frederick Coleman Patterson, he taught at Ohio State before he started teaching at Central State. And he taught at Ohio State, and one of the things he did is he went through the archives, and he found out that our grandfather, Frederick Douglass, played football at Ohio State. And then he found out that Frederick Douglass was the first black quarterback at Ohio State. And the reason he was the first black quarterback is because at that time they ran the single wing. All you football fans know that, the difference between football in the 1890s and football today. But he was the first black quarterback at Ohio State. And the committee asked me to talk about my family, so I'm going to do that a little bit. My first memories of Greenfield, that on Sundays, we would drive from Xenia to Greenfield. And it's not like it is today on 35. New 35 has nice, I was telling my wife this morning, there's a nice smooth road. I know you've all driven down old 35. And back in the 1940s, it was even smaller. And so we would drive from Xenia to Greenfield, and my parents would visit the Pettifords and another family, and I can't remember their name, but that's where we would come to Greenfield and to visit these folks. And as we grew, my brother and sister, First, it was all three of us, and then it was just Betty and myself, because Freddie had gotten old enough that he could stay by himself for the afternoon or the day. And then later on, it was Betty stayed at home, my sister Betty, and I had to come to Greenfield to see all these old people, which I am now one of. One of the first, but that was my first memory of Greenfield in coming here. One of my first memories, not first memories about my dad, but when I was in the 7th, 8th grade, we were talking about the Civil War in class. And so I go home and I start talking with my dad, and I start questioning him about his grandfather. And I'm saying that his grandfather had to be a slave, because in my 12-year-old mind, all blacks were slaves. And he said no, his dad was a free man, he's a free person, and that all of his family was free, and that at that time that his grandfather was born, there were over 1,000 free Negroes in the South. There's probably more than that. But because of the slave laws, that's even Virginia, where C.R. was born in 1833, they moved because in Virginia, any African American, mulatto, whatever, could be taken into slavery at any time by any white person who had a grudge against that person, or it doesn't even have to be a grudge, but they could be taken into slavery and you might never find them again. So a family, it was Charles Patterson, Nancy, his wife, and C.R. and two brothers. They moved to Ohio from Virginia in 1833, and they got to Ohio around 1840. And there is that myth that C.R. swam across the Ohio River. That would be quite a chore, quite a feat for an 8-year-old. And so another thing that I was thinking about, and about this time, and about my dad. My dad went to Ohio State, and my mom went to Wilberforce College at the time. And one thing I have to say about my grandfather on my mother's side, Harvey Coleman. Harvey Coleman in 1920, he sent 2 women to college, and they both graduated. And if you think about that, how long it's taken for black women to go to college, for women, period, actually, to start to go to college and get a college education. But in basically the 1920s, he sent 2 black women to college, and they both graduated. My mom ended up teaching at Tuskegee. She taught at Tuskegee for a while, and then also at South Carolina State. And my Aunt Ines, my mom's sister, she went and she's taught at North Carolina A&T. She came back to Central State, Wilberforce, and then went back to North Carolina A&T at that time. And one other thing about the family in general, it's a family of teachers. So my mom was a teacher, my brother is a teacher, my sister's a teacher. I've been a therapist for over 50 years, so that has a lot to do with teaching. But anyway, my dad and my mom, my dad was going to Ohio State, my mom was going to Central State. And he would drive on Route 42. He'd drive from Columbus down to Wilberforce. And he'd meet my mom, and they were courting. And when they would go to events, and this always cracked me up, he would go and he would talk to my mom in the dormitory or wherever, and then if they had to go someplace on campus, the women would walk on one sidewalk and the men would walk on the other. And then when they got to where they were going, then they could start to commingle. But as they were walking from one place to the other, they had to walk on separate sidewalks. And the Reverend shaking her head, so she probably recognizes that. Um, and my dad studied engineering at Ohio State, and after 3 years, he left to join the family business as a designer. And what he would do, he would make they were building trucks. This is in the 20s, and so they're building trucks and buses and whatnot. And he would make adjustments to the bus or the truck designs that they were doing to meet the individual needs of each one of those companies. So, like for the international, there's a photo that I have. I don't know if it's in Chris's book or not, but it's a photo of trucks out here on Jefferson Street, and have all these trucks ready for delivery to International Harvester. So one of the things my dad did while he was working for the company, back in the 1920s, camping was becoming very popular. And so he designed a camping trailer. And this trailer had a shower, a cook space, a refrigerator, a bedroom, and a toilet in it. And if you think about when we were driving down here, you can see this. There's a big RV park not too far from here, and there's RVs for as far as you could see. But this was a travel trailer, and I remember seeing those plans because in our house in Wilberforce, he had them. My dad had them in the chest of drawer. And then when the tornado hit in '76, there probably might be in somebody's backyard down here because it was, it was all destroyed, whatnot. So after, I have to say this, my dad's brother, Postel, when my dad and mom got married, they were all living together here in Greenfield. And my brother was about 6. He was about 6. And Betty was about 3. And I hadn't been born yet. But Postel was one of the primary salespeople for the business. And he would drive a bus home. And so when they all lived in the same house. And so when he'd drive home, Freddie would say, "Here comes bus," and Betty would say, "Here comes bus." So Uncle Postel became Uncle Bus. So, and he's been Uncle Bus ever since then. Come on. All right. When the company ended, as you know, Postel and his wife Kathleen and a couple other people, and my dad, they attempted to move the company to Gallipolis, and the Gallipolis Bus and Body Company, whatever, and tried to make a go of it for a couple of years down there. And Aunt Kay tells a story about when they were opening the business in Gallipolis. They had this big empty warehouse, and she said she remembers going in and sweeping up, and one of the things that she swept up was a rattlesnake. So I said, that's not a good start. And so my dad recognized that the company is going to be a hard pull, and so he had a wife and 2 children to feed, and so he left Postel and the company, and he moved the family. First, he moved to Linden, where my mom was from, and then he moved to Xenia and he got a job at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and he was working at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and as a sheet metal engineer, and I wasn't born yet, so because he had 2 kids to support, and it's really humbling to hear all the stories about the family, and also to be here. Thank you. I remember Aunt Kay, Postel's wife, being the Grand Marshal for Wheels of Progress. And I have a T-shirt. I have T-shirts that are so old. But I have this T-shirt that says C.R. Patterson's and Sons. It has Wheels of Progress on the front and one of the Patterson ads on the big ad on the back. So, but on behalf of the Patterson family, I want to thank the community of Greenfield, the Greenfield Historical Society, Harold and Judy Schmidt, Tom Smith, for keeping, I know I'm going to leave somebody out, Tom Smith, and for keeping the Patterson family story out there and available. And like so many people have said, this is a part of American history that people really don't know about. But I want to thank them. I also would like to thank Christopher Nielsen for writing his master's thesis and writing historically correct history of the C.R. Pattersons and Sons. C.R. had 13 brothers and sisters, and they're still, I am the last of that, well, my son is the last of Frederick Douglass's line, but there are other Pattersons from Charles and Nancy spread throughout the country. But I do want to thank Chris for writing his master's thesis, historically correct, and seeking additional information from my sister and I. I also want to thank Nancy for creating this beautiful mural. And yesterday, when I first saw it, I teared up like I'm doing now. But I really do want to thank the community of Greenfield, because you all have kept this story alive, and I really do appreciate it. We all appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, as my dad used to say, you got more than the price of admission for that. So our next speaker is not a native of Greenfield. When she came to town, she didn't spend very long getting herself knit into the community. She's had a long career in the commercial and educational settings. She's won many awards. She's inspired many young people in their art career. She's worked in many mediums, including design and mosaics. Now she can add muralists to the list. Please help me welcome Nancy Crawford.
Thank you all for being here, and I want to thank you all for the opportunity to do this mural. When I heard the Patterson story, I just couldn't believe what an awesome story, and what a story that America needs to hear right now. It's just amazing to know that these people they worked hard and they overcame so many obstacles. I love the Booker T. Washington quote that we put on the building here. If our vision is clear, our will strong, we will use the very obstacles that often seem to beset us as stepping stones to a higher and more useful life. Isn't that what it's all about? You know, it's a wonderful thing. So when I heard about the Patterson story, I just decided I'm going to do a mural somewhere, you know. So I started, you know, messing around, talking to people, and G3 was so helpful, and they decided that they would helped me fund it and write grants and things like that, and they were wonderful. And again, I didn't have, this is my first mural, so they were taking a chance on me. But thank you. Now, I've done a lot of art, a lot of pieces of art, theater sets and things like that, but never murals. So this has just been a lot of fun for me, and it's been awesome. And I appreciate you guys being here and taking the time to learn about the Pattersons. It's an amazing story. So my big thing to challenge you all is to get involved and to step up and be a part of Greenfield's bright future. What are we going to do from here? What kind of obstacles are we going to overcome? We've already improved Greenfield so much, but what does the future hold? What is it? Let's work together and do some great things and make Greenfield even more beautiful. Maybe more murals, maybe more a museum. I've heard talk of a museum already, which I think would be awesome. Anyway, it's in your hands, Greenfield, and you're a great community.
And like I mentioned earlier, it took a lot of people. All these people that spoke today have shown a grace and kindness and everything that we asked them to do. So I do have to mention, we are standing on Pat and Elaine Hayes' parking lot. I'm on a platform that the city supplied and under a tent that the city supplied. And I really want to thank Harriet Fout and Hannibal Evans for letting us use their wall. So I would like to welcome now the Greenfield City Manager to come up and please read a proclamation.
I get the easy job. So thank you for sharing the history of a wonderful family. My family's here today. They got to learn something new today. So this is not the first time they've heard the story, but there's tidbits that they got to hear that was new today. So we're very thankful for those who may be visiting Greenfield. So welcome to Greenfield. For those who call this home, we're here, right? And I just wanted to point out something on the mural here. It's a beautiful mural. It does recognize a rich history, but the true mayor is on that wall. I think, is that Biscuit? Did you paint Biscuit? Yeah, so that's Hannah Bivens' dog. If anybody wants to know what the bulldog is, that's the true mayor of Greenfield. So he was voted in a couple years ago. One thing that's interesting when we were looking at providing this proclamation today is in 2003, the mayor at the time was Laney Bryant. And Laney Bryant knew the story, right? And Laney's not with us today. But Laney knew that it was important enough to recognize that there should be a day that is known as the Patterson Family Day. And that day, believe it or not, in 2003 was July 20th. So here we are again, recognizing July 20th as the Patterson Family Day. Now, my speech, I didn't plan anything, so I'm kind of talking off the cuff here a little bit. But these whereases, they're not fun. So if I mess up on some of these whereases, don't hold it against me. But this is proclamation language, okay? So we're going to start. Whereas the C.R. Patterson family has been a pioneering and influential force in the history of Greenfield, Ohio, and the broader automobile manufacturing industry, and whereas Charles Richard C.R. Patterson, the patriarch of the Patterson family, founded C.R. Patterson and Sons, an enterprise that holds the distinction of being the first African-American owned automobile manufacturing company in the United States. And whereas the C.R. Patterson family, through their innovation, perseverance, and entrepreneurial spirit, significantly contributed to the development and progress of the automotive industry during a pivotal time in American history, and whereas their legacy of craftsmanship and excellence in automobile manufacturing has brought national recognition to Greenfield, highlighting the village's rich industrial heritage, and whereas the contributions of the C.R. Patterson family have served as an inspiration and source of pride for generations, fostering a spirit of innovation and resilience within the community, and whereas the C.R. Patterson family's commitment to excellence and their trailblazing achievements continue to be celebrated and remembered as a vital part of Greenfield's history and cultural heritage. Now therefore be it resolved that the Council of the Village of Greenfield, Highland County, State of Ohio, does hereby proclaim the 20th day of July 2024 and 2003, right, as Patterson Family Day, and call the attention of all citizens of Greenfield to this observance. So this concludes our proclamation and is signed by the President of Council, Phil Clyburn, Mr. Phil Clyburn. So thank you.
So I want to thank you all for coming today. This really came together well. We had beautiful weather. I want to thank the Car Club for moving their car show up to Jefferson Street so we didn't have traffic going by. I want to thank G3 for bringing in food trucks. There is just a lot of good things going on in Greenfield. It was mentioned earlier, the Presbyterian windows. So if you would, go get some lunch. There's food trucks, there's restaurants. Take some time at the car show. When you walk up to the school for their program at 2 o'clock, please take a look at those windows that have been restored. There is a great story behind that, and this mural kind of tells that story that we've kind of stamped a part of history right in the middle of town. And it's those little things that are going to make people think and remember all these great people, and I can't thank all these people enough for coming. Now, you get to these occasions, they like to do ribbon cuttings. We got a giant ribbon. We got a giant pair of scissors. We're going to cut a ribbon. The last kind of point I have is Chris has been wonderful with his book. There are books available at the Historical Society, and they are there today if anybody would like a copy, signed copies. So if we could, oh yeah, and Tom Smith has been gracious enough to bring buggies at Southern Hills Bank. So please take a second and look at that. There is some amazing pieces over there. So if we could. Just a thank you all.
Yes.
I would like to thank you all for coming. Please take a look at all the cars, Tom's display, stop and get a book. This has been a wonderful day and a wonderful event. Thank you very much.